In the final days of World War II, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Nazi Germany, American military police units were tasked with a grim but crucial mission: tracking down and arresting SS personnel who had committed war crimes. Among the most shocking discoveries were the female SS guards, who had overseen some of the most brutal conditions in the camps. This is the story of how these women, who had long believed themselves untouchable under the Nazi regime, finally faced the justice they had evaded for years when American MPs spoke those fateful words that would change their lives forever. The stench was the first thing that hit you, a thick, cloying blanket of human suffering and decay that permeated everything. It clung to the air, to your uniform, to your very soul. Sergeant Thomas Miller, a veteran MP whose eyes had seen too much across Europe, felt it burrow deep, chilling him in a way no winter battle ever had. He scanned the scene before him, the recently liberated Dachau. It wasn't a battlefield. It was something far worse, a landscape sculpted by premeditated evil. The liberation had unfolded rapidly, a blur of combat, and then, abruptly, this silent, horrifying aftermath. Emaciated figures draped in striped rags shuffled through the mud, their eyes hollow, their movements slow, their very existence a question mark. Some simply sat, staring blankly, their capacity for joy or terror seemingly burned out. Piles of skeletal bodies lay haphazardly, mute testaments to unspeakable atrocities, each one a life extinguished, a story unfinished. American GIs, still reeling from the shock of discovery, moved with a grim, methodical efficiency, trying to bring order to hell on earth. They distributed water, wrapped blankets around shivering forms, and tried to speak words of comfort that felt utterly inadequate. Corporal Daniel Hayes, barely out of his teens, stumbled beside Miller, his face a sickly pale green. He looked ready to vomit. Hayes had been a starry-eyed kid a few months ago, dreaming of fighting Nazis and seeing Europe. He'd envisioned heroic charges, clear enemies, and the clean victory of good over evil. Now Europe was showing him its true, festering face, a reality far more complex and sickening than any battlefield. His idealism was being systematically stripped away, replaced by a raw, guttural horror. "Sweet Jesus," Hayes whispered, his voice thin, barely audible above the low moans and the distant rumble of trucks. I don't understand, Sarge. How could this happen? To people?" He choked back a sob, his young face contorted in disbelief and sorrow. Miller didn't answer immediately. He had no words. What could he say? He'd been in the war since North Africa, fought through Sicily, Salerno, the Ardennes. He'd seen men kill with cold precision, driven by desperation or hatred. But this was different. This was beyond the calculus of war. This was something fundamentally broken in humanity. He watched a young private, no older than Hayes, gently offer a piece of bread to a survivor, whose trembling hands could barely grasp it. The gratitude in the survivor's eyes was like a physical blow, a sudden, piercing light in the crushing darkness. Miller had seen carnage. He had witnessed the aftermath of battles that shredded men into unrecognizable pulp. But this was systematic. This was industrialized death, processed with chilling, bureaucratic efficiency. It was a factory of suffering, and it spoke of a cold, calculated malevolence that haunted him more than any gunshot. A jeep pulled up, splashing mud that splattered onto Miller's already grimy uniform. Captain Eleanor Vance, a woman whose crisp uniform and sharper-than-nails gaze commanded immediate respect, stepped out. She walked with purpose, her boots crunching on the gravel, a stark contrast to the shuffling of the survivors. Her expression was set, a mask of professional resolve. But Miller, accustomed to reading people, caught a flicker of the same deep-seated horror in her eyes that he felt in his own gut. She was formidable, a former lawyer who had traded courtrooms for battlefields, and she carried the weight of her responsibilities with an almost terrifying composure. "Miller, Hayes," Vance said, her voice clipped, professional, cutting through the morbid air. "Report to HQ, now. We have a new assignment, one that required a specific kind of detachment." The HQ was a requisitioned German villa in Munich, its opulent furnishings now incongruous with the stark reality being processed within its walls. Tapestries depicting pastoral scenes hung oddly beside maps of bombed-out cities. Crystal chandeliers illuminated tables littered with files, some spilling their contents onto the polished parquet floor. Typewriters clattered a relentless, mournful rhythm, documenting the unspeakable. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of stale coffee, a pungent odor that mingled with the faint, persistent ghost of the camps that Miller felt he carried everywhere. Captain Vance stood before a large situation map, her pointer tapping at a region east of Frankfurt. Dora Mittelbau. The name echoed, a chilling whisper from a fresh hell. Miller and Hayes stood at attention, their uniforms still bearing the invisible grime of Dachau, their minds still processing the unfathomable images seared into their memories. "Gentlemen, the liberation of these camps has uncovered unspeakable crimes," Vance began, her voice steady, devoid of overt emotion, yet resonating with an undeniable gravitas. "The perpetrators, many of whom have vanished into the civilian population, must be brought to justice. It is not enough to have won the war. We must also win the peace, and that means accountability. Our specific focus will be the Dora Mittelbau complex and its satellite camps. Its conditions were particularly brutal, even by SS standards. Forced labor, starvation, medical experimentation, a true distillation of Nazi depravity." She turned, her gaze sweeping over them, assessing their readiness, their resilience. "Your mission is unprecedented. We are not just hunting soldiers. We are hunting war criminals, and many of them are women. Female SS auxiliary staff, Aufseherinnen, overseers, guards. They were there, every bit as much as the men." Hayes blinked, a confused frown creasing his brow. "Women, Captain. Guarding. Prisoners. What kind of women?" The incredulity was evident in his tone, a reflection of the societal norms he had grown up with, where women were mothers, wives, nurses, not instruments of systematic terror. Vance's expression hardened, a glint of steel in her eyes. "Yes, Corporal, women, just as capable of cruelty, complicity, and active participation in these horrors as any man. In some cases more so, because their involvement was often shrouded in a perverse blend of domesticity and sadism. They served as guards, wardens, even torturers. They facilitated the systematic murder of hundreds of thousands. They are not to be underestimated, nor are they to be treated with any less resolve than their male counterparts. This isn't about gender, it's about crimes against humanity." She laid a stack of rough sketches and translated witness statements on the polished table. The drawings, crude and distorted, depicted figures wielding whips, surrounded by snarling dogs. The statements detailed random beatings, starvation, forced labor until death. Some accounts were so graphic, so chilling, that even Miller, with all his battle-hardened experience, felt a fresh wave of nausea. "We have fragmented intelligence," Vance continued, tapping the papers with a manicured finger. "Survivors speak of two names, often recurring. Elsa Keller, described as overtly sadistic, notorious for her dog. Satan, who she would set on prisoners for sport. And Greta Hoffman, less prone to physical violence herself, but known for her cold, bureaucratic efficiency, her chilling indifference while implementing directives that led to countless deaths. She sorted the sick from the healthy, the strong from the weak, sending thousands to their doom with a mere flick of her wrist. We believe both served at Dora and its subcamps." Miller nodded, his jaw tight. This was a new kind of war, a hunt for a different kind of enemy, one that wore a human face, often one that had once been considered normal. It was a war against the shadow that lurked in the human heart, capable of such monstrous deeds. "It will be difficult," Vance warned, reading his thoughts, her gaze piercing. "Many records are gone, deliberately destroyed. Identities have been changed. They will blend into the population, deny everything, feign ignorance. And the psychological toll, it will be immense. You will hear things, see things, that will test your very soul. Do you understand the gravity of what I am asking?" "Yes, Captain," Miller said, his voice flat, resolute, though inside a storm was brewing. Hayes, still grappling with the sheer depravity of it all, could only manage a slow nod, his knuckles white where he gripped his belt. The task ahead felt like wading into a cesspool of evil, one they might never fully emerge from clean. Their initial task was to canvass the burgeoning displaced persons camps, interviewing survivors from Dora Mittelbau. The Nordhausen DP camp was a sprawling makeshift city of tents and barracks, filled with the ghosts of the living. The air buzzed with 100 languages, 100 traumas, a cacophony of suffering that assaulted the senses. The landscape itself was pockmarked with bomb craters, and the few standing buildings were hollowed out, shells of their former selves. Logistical challenges were immediate. Fuel was scarce, roads were often impassable, and trust was a rare commodity. Miller and Hayes moved slowly through the camp. Their uniforms, though a symbol of liberation, often met with a mixture of hope and deep-seated fear. Many survivors had seen uniforms before, and they remembered the terror they represented. They learned quickly that trauma had fractured memories, making coherent narratives rare. Survivors often spoke in disjointed fragments, their minds replaying horrifying scenes like broken records. Yet, certain details, certain names, emerged with chilling consistency, recurring like a malevolent chant. An elderly Polish woman, her face a roadmap of suffering, her eyes sunken and haunted, gripped Miller's arm with surprising strength. The one with the dog, she rasped in broken German, her gaze distant, fixed on some unseen horror. Always the dog, a German shepherd. She called him Satan. She set him on us for nothing just to see us fall. Elsa, her name was Elsa. She liked to watch us bleed. The memory brought a fresh wave of terror to her ancient face. Later, a young Jewish man, no more than 20 but looking 50, his body emaciated to a skeletal frame, spoke in a hushed, trembling voice. Greta Hoffman. She didn't hit. Not often. But she would stand there watching as they beat you. Her face, it was empty. She would decide who went to the clinic when they were sick. The clinic. It was always the crematorium. He shivered uncontrollably, pulling his threadbare blanket tighter around him, as if to ward off the coldness of her memory. She just watched. No emotion, like a statue of death. The stories were fragments, flashes of unbearable pain, but they began to paint a mosaic of two distinct personalities, two faces of evil, yet disturbingly human. Miller and Hayes collected what they could, a description of a particular scar, a distinctive way someone walked, a remembered piece of jewelry, a specific uniform detail. They were like detectives sifting through the ashes of a nightmare, trying to reconstruct a crime scene from memory and whispers. They started compiling a file, a wanted poster of the ghosts they sought, the names etched into their minds. Hayes, in particular, struggled to reconcile the image of women with these monstrous deeds. Every testimony chipped away at his conventional understanding of the world. The next phase of their investigation took them to a requisitioned German government building in Berlin, now serving as a U.S. Army records office. The once grand halls, meant for administrative pomp, were crammed with file cabinets, their contents a jumble of bureaucracy and destruction. Documents, some pristine, some partially burned, filled every available space. The smell of old paper mingled with the lingering scent of smoke, a constant reminder of the chaos and violence that had swept through this city. Civilian clerks, mostly women, worked under the watchful eyes of American guards, their faces impassive, their cooperation grudging. Miller and Hayes spent weeks poring over thousands of German records, military enlistment papers, civilian employment files, local registry documents, party membership lists. The task was painstakingly slow, mind-numbing work that often felt like chasing shadows. They taught themselves basic German, enough to navigate officialese and understand fragmented testimonies. The sheer volume of paper was overwhelming, a testament to the meticulous yet ultimately destructive German bureaucratic machine. "Find anything, Corporal?" Miller grunted, elbow deep in a stack of pre-war civil service files, his eyes burning from lack of sleep. Hayes shook his head, pushing his spectacles up his nose, frustration etched on his young face. Just another 100 more forms for women named Greta, who worked in textile factories. None of them match our description of Hoffman. It's like they just ceased to exist before 42, then reappeared as monsters with new identities. He slammed a file shut, a rare show of temper. Miller nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "That's exactly what they want us to think, Dan. They spent years perfecting this game. Disappearing acts were standard procedure for the SS. He pulled out a dusty personnel file, its corner bent, a faint coffee stain on the cover. Look at this. Elsa Keller, teacher. Born 1905, small town near Leipzig. Joined the League of German Girls, then SS Helferinnen. Seems like a perfectly normal progression for an ideologue. No explicit mention of Dora, but the dates for her transfer. They line up perfectly with the camp's establishment and the surge in Aufseherinnen recruitment. The records were a twisted mirror, reflecting a chilling transformation. They saw ordinary lives, a schoolteacher, a factory worker, a farmer's daughter. Women who, by all accounts, had been unremarkable. Unremarkable until the Nazi ideology seeped into their souls. Yet something in the machinery of the Third Reich had twisted them into something horrifying. Miller often found himself wondering what it was. Pure ideological fervor, cold opportunism, fear of not conforming, or simply a latent cruelty unleashed by absolute power. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach, a question that offered no easy answers. The banality of the evil, as Vance had said, was its most insidious aspect. Dead ends were common. Misinformation, deliberate or accidental, was rampant. Many Germans were eager to deny any knowledge, to claim ignorance, to simply forget the atrocities, to erase their own complicity. But Vance had drilled it into them, patience and persistence. The truth is always there, gentlemen, she'd said. It just needs to be dug up. One afternoon, a few weeks into the document dive, Hayes let out a sudden exclamation that echoed through the quiet office. Sarge, look at this. Greta Hoffman, pre-war, worked in the municipal archives in Paderborn. Her sister, a Hildegard Schmidt, still lives there. Address listed here. He pointed a triumphant finger at a smudged line of text, his face alight with renewed purpose. This looks solid, Miller. Family connections, pre-war occupation, civilian records. It's a direct link. A small breakthrough. A crack in the wall of secrecy. Paderborn. It wasn't Dora Mittelbau, but it was a link. A thread to pull. Their next stop was Paderborn, a town scarred but not completely destroyed by the war. The roads were often impassable, choked with rubble or choked with refugees. They navigated the bombed-out streets, the skeletal remains of buildings looming against the gray sky. They found Hildegard Schmidt living in a small, cramped apartment, its windows repaired with cardboard. She was a thin, nervous woman, wary and suspicious of the two American MPs, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. She denied knowing any Greta Hoffman, her voice a thin, reedy whisper. She clutched a worn rosary in her trembling hands. But Miller was experienced in reading fear, in understanding the unspoken language of guilt and evasion. He pressed gently, showing her a composite sketch based on survivor descriptions, a crude drawing that still captured the coldness in Greta's eyes. Hildegard's facade crumbled slowly, revealing a fear deeper than just of the Allied occupation. She admitted her sister had visited briefly after the war, desperate for money. Her appearance altered, her hair dyed, but had then disappeared again, like a phantom. Where did she go, Frau Schmidt? Miller asked, his voice firm but not threatening, his eyes never leaving hers. It's important. This isn't about minor transgressions. This is about murder. Hildegard hesitated, glancing nervously around the meager room, as if invisible walls had ears. She talked about going south, to the Bavarian forests. Said she had a cousin there, a farmer, a place where no one would ask questions. She thought it would be safe there, away from everything. The information was vague, but it was a direction, a region to focus their search on. A needle in a haystack, but at least they had a haystack now. It was in Paderborn that they also encountered Frau Richter, a woman in her late 50s, a former civilian employee who had worked in a lower administrative capacity at a camp office near Dora Mittelbau. She had been picked up for minor collaboration, funneling supplies, albeit indirectly, to the SS, and was now awaiting sentencing. Miller and Hayes were given permission to interrogate her, a process that felt more like extracting teeth than conversation. Frau Richter was initially defiant, her face a mask of indignation, her voice shrill with self-righteousness. I just did my job. I had no choice. My family would have starved. Everyone was doing it. she insisted, wringing her hands, her eyes avoiding theirs. Miller leaned forward, his voice calm, conversational, cutting through her protests. Frau Richter, we know you had a choice. Perhaps not easy ones, but choices nonetheless. We're not here about the paperwork you pushed or the supplies you channeled. We're here about the faces you saw, the women you worked with. Elsa Keller, Greta Hoffman. He showed her the crude sketches, and this time, the effect was immediate and profound. Frau Richter flinched, her body recoiling. The mask began to crack, fear now overriding indignation. Elsa, she whispered, a shudder running through her thin frame. She was terrifying. Her dog, Satan, he was always with her. He was almost as cruel as she was. She seemed to enjoy disciplining the prisoners. She found pleasure in their pain. A pause, then a desperate attempt to justify her own inaction, to absolve herself. What could I do? She had absolute power. They all did. And Greta Hoffman? Hayes asked, his pen poised over his notepad, his gaze fixed on Frau Richter. Frau Richter shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting nervously. Greta, she was quiet, very precise. Always made sure the transport lists were correct. The ones for the relocation of the sick, you understand. She always confirmed the numbers, never raised her voice, never smiled, never showed emotion. But her eyes, so cold, like glass, like looking into a deep, dark well. The memory clearly unsettled her more than Keller's overt cruelty. She spoke often of her sister, a cousin in a village south, near a small river, said it was very peaceful there. She thought about retiring there after the war was won. A quiet life after all that. A glint of spite entered her eyes. She always thought they would win. The bitter irony of it hung heavy in the air. The Bavarian forests were a mosaic of deep green and gray in the late autumn of 1945, the air crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Miller and Hayes, following the new lead from Frau Richter, crisscrossed dozens of small villages, showing their sketches, asking questions. The population was wary, suspicious of any authority, American or otherwise. Most villagers were tight-lipped, eager to put the war behind them, to forget the uncomfortable truths that lay buried just beneath the surface of their quiet lives. Displaced persons and former soldiers roamed the countryside, adding to the general disarray and making identification harder. It was in a village so small it barely registered on their maps, nestled beside a winding river, that they found their first real trace. A local innkeeper, after a carefully placed pack of Lucky Strikes and a bottle of surprisingly good schnapps, mentioned a new woman who had arrived a few months ago. A widow, quiet, kept to herself. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of the village, away from prying eyes. She made excellent bread, he added, almost as an afterthought, an odd detail that painted a picture of domestic normalcy. They staked out the cottage. For 2 days they watched, their patience honed by months of war and weeks of tedious investigation. A woman, seemingly in her late 40s, emerged each morning to tend a small garden, hang laundry on a line, or walk to the village for supplies. She was unremarkable in every way. Average height, mousy brown hair pulled back in a neat bun, plain dress, sensible shoes. Her movements were calm, measured, almost serene. She bought bread at the local bakery, exchanged polite but brief words with the baker, and returned to her cottage. She was the picture of a respectable, quiet German widow, blending seamlessly into the rural landscape. Greta Hoffman. The realization settled on Miller with a heavy dread. Hayes, watching through binoculars from a hidden vantage point in the dense woods, lowered them, a look of profound disbelief on his face. That's her, Sarge? She looks like anybody's aunt. She doesn't look like she could organize anything more than a church bake sale, let alone mass murder. She looks harmless. His voice was tinged with a raw, almost childish confusion. Miller kept his eyes on the cottage, a grim set to his jaw. That's the most dangerous kind, Corporal. The ones who look like anybody's aunt? The ones who facilitate horror without raising their voice or their hand? The ones who make the trains run on time, no matter what cargo they carry? She wasn't the one swinging the whip, Dan, but she pointed the way to the gallows for countless souls. His voice was low, filled with a visceral unease. The banality of this woman's evil was almost harder to comprehend than Keller's overt sadism. It was an evil that masqueraded as competence, as duty, as normalcy. It defied easy categorization, and that made it all the more unsettling. They decided to approach her in the late afternoon, when the village was quiet and her routine predictable. After her last trip to the village, they wanted no witnesses, no drama, just a swift, firm arrest. They had seen enough chaos. Miller and Hayes walked up the worn stone path to the cottage door. The late autumn light cast long shadows, painting the scene in muted, somber tones. The air was still, save for the distant crow of a rooster. Miller knocked, a sharp, resonant sound that seemed to echo in the stillness. The door opened almost immediately. Greta Hoffman stood there, a faint, polite smile on her lips, her hands clasped in front of her, an almost domestic pose. She wore a simple apron over her plain dress, a wisp of hair escaping her bun. She looked utterly normal, utterly harmless, a picture of unassuming German womanhood. Miller looked her dead in the eye, his gaze unwavering, resolute. His voice was steady, firm, carrying the weight of all the suffering he had witnessed, all the lives she had carelessly extinguished. Greta Hoffman, you're under arrest for crimes against humanity committed at Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. The smile vanished instantly, as if wiped clean from her face by an invisible hand. Her face, which moments before had held a polite pleasantness, drained of all color, turning a ghastly white. Her jaw went slack, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and dawning terror. The composure shattered, revealing the raw, panicked animal underneath. You must have the wrong woman," she stammered, her voice thin, trembling, barely a whisper. "I am Frau Schmidt, a widow. I have lived here quietly for months. I know nothing of what you speak. I am a simple baker's wife." She tried to close the door, a desperate, futile gesture, her hand shaking violently on the wooden frame. Miller blocked it with his foot, his presence immovable, a solid wall of American authority. "No, Frau Hoffman, we don't have the wrong woman." He pulled a small, tarnished silver locket from his pocket, a piece of evidence, a minor detail from a survivor's testimony that had been dismissed as irrelevant until now. A small, almost insignificant object, yet now imbued with the power of undeniable truth. This locket was found at a subcamp of Dora. A survivor described it vividly, said it belonged to the Officerin who oversaw the medical selection at Camp 3, said she wore it daily. It bears your initials, GH. Engraved on the back, it was found in a small hidden compartment in your locker. Greta's eyes darted to the locket, then back to Miller's face, her breath catching in her throat. A flicker of raw animal fear, then something else, cold hatred, resentment, betrayal, replaced the initial panic. Her denial was a flimsy veil, easily torn away by the weight of proof. "It's a lie. Propaganda, you make it up. I was just a civilian clerk forced to work. I did nothing. I was a victim too." Her voice rose, shrill and desperate, cracking with a sudden venomous edge, revealing the monster underneath the carefully constructed facade. The quiet homemaker was gone, replaced by a snarling, terrified prisoner. Hayes stepped forward, his handcuffs ready, his face grim. "We have witness testimony, Frau Hoffman, detailed descriptions, your supervisor's reports, your own handwriting on transport manifests, authorizing the relocation of thousands. Your role was extensive and willingly undertaken." Greta spat at them, a sudden, furious outburst, the mask of civility completely gone. "You Americans, you know nothing. You soft fools. We were saving Europe from the Bolsheviks. I did my duty, for the fatherland." She lunged, a surprising burst of strength, trying to claw at Miller's face, her nails surprisingly sharp. Miller easily sidestepped her, his movements economical and practiced. Hayes moved quickly, expertly snapping the cuffs onto her wrists, the cold metal a stark contrast to her trembling flesh. The metallic click echoed sharply, a sound of finality. Greta struggled, but her efforts were pathetic against the trained MPs. She cursed them, the Allies, the Jews, spewing a torrent of vitriol and Nazi ideology. But her defiance was impotent, her rage a futile struggle against the inevitable. She was led away, her small, quiet life crumbling into dust. The transition from demure widow to ranting Nazi was stark, a horrifying confirmation of the monster beneath the facade. As they drove away, a few curious villagers peered from behind curtains, their faces unreadable. Back in the Munich HQ, Captain Vance was pleased but sobered. One down, a quiet evil, but evil nonetheless. Now for the other. Keller is the bigger fish, the more dangerous one, the fanatic. We need her, and she won't go down so easily. Her tone indicated a new level of urgency. The successful capture of Hoffman had energized the team, but they knew Keller would be a different challenge entirely. Greta Hoffman was interrogated relentlessly in a stark, utilitarian room. The initial politeness had long vanished from her demeanor, replaced by a sullen, manipulative defiance. She maintained her stance of victimhood, weaving elaborate tales of coercion and fear, claiming she was merely a cog in a giant, terrifying machine, powerless to resist. She cried, she pleaded, she painted herself as a gentle, unwilling participant. But Miller and Hayes had been trained by the best, and they had seen too much to be swayed by theatrics. They meticulously presented her with the overwhelming evidence, witness statements from multiple camps, corroborating accounts, SS internal memos bearing her signature, forensic analysis of the locket found in her locker, her own meticulous handwriting on transport manifests. They also brought up the impending Nuremberg trials, the possibility of facing the full weight of international justice, the likelihood of a long, brutal sentence. The pressure mounted, relentless and systematic. Finally, broken and cornered, a new emotion surfaced in Greta, a seething spite, a desire for vengeance against those who had brought her down. She wasn't repentant, she was vengeful, especially against those she felt had been more successful, more fanatical. Elsa Keller, she sneered, her voice raspy with suppressed fury. She was always the worst, the true believer. She enjoyed it. Too much. She used to talk about a network, Die Treuen, the loyal ones, old SS who would shelter each other, disappear into the rural areas. She was obsessed with secrecy, with loyalty. She provided details, not out of any sense of justice, but seemingly to drag Keller down with her, to spread the misery. Elsa's family. They were staunch Nazis even before the party took power, an old farmstead deep in the Black Forest, remote, isolated, old connections, old loyalties. That's where she'd go. She'd think it was safe, a fortress of the faithful, the Black Forest. A fitting hiding place for such darkness, a place of ancient trees and deep shadows, where secrets could easily be kept. The lead was vague, requiring more weeks of careful investigation, poring over old land records, obscure family histories, and pre-war maps. They consulted with local German officials, often facing thinly veiled hostility or outright obstruction. But eventually, after much painstaking effort, they found it. A remote, crumbling farmstead isolated by dense woods, seemingly cut off from the modern world. It was a cold, gray December morning when Miller, Hayes, and a small contingent of MPs moved in. The ground was frosted, and a thin mist hung low among the trees. The farmstead looked deserted, save for a wisp of smoke from the chimney, a telltale sign of habitation. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, every sense alert. They knew Keller would be dangerous. As they neared the main farmhouse, a guttural snarl ripped through the crisp air. A large German shepherd, its fur bristling, its teeth bared, burst from around the corner of the barn, eyes blazing with savage aggression. It was a formidable beast, clearly trained for attack. "Satan," Hayes whispered, his voice tight, recognizing the infamous description from survivor testimonies. The dog charged, a terrifying blur of muscle and fury. Before the dog could reach them, a shot rang out from the lead MP. A clean, swift kill honed by months of combat. The animal dropped, lifeless, a heavy thud on the frozen ground. Almost immediately, a figure appeared in the doorway of the farmhouse, silhouetted against the dim interior light, a hunting rifle clutched in her hands. Elsa Keller. She was gaunt, her face etched with desperation and defiance, but her eyes still held the fanatical fire of a true believer, an unyielding fanaticism. "You American pigs!" she shrieked, her voice raw, echoing through the quiet woods laced with a venomous hatred. "You will never take me. The Reich lives." She raised the rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. Before she could fire, Miller, trained for such confrontations, moved with practiced speed. He lunged forward, knocking the rifle aside, sending it clattering to the muddy ground. A brief, brutal struggle ensued. Elsa Keller fought like a cornered animal, with a ferocity born of fanaticism and desperation. She kicked, scratched, bit, spitting venom and Nazi ideology. She was powerful, fueled by a ferocious, unrepentant hatred. But Miller was stronger, more skilled, and Hayes quickly assisted, subduing her with a practiced move. She continued to scream, a torrent of Nazi slogans and vile curses, even as the handcuffs were clamped on her wrists. "Heil Hitler! The Reich will rise again. You Jews will pay for this. You cannot defeat the will of the pure race." Her words, chillingly out of place in the peaceful forest, confirmed every dark suspicion they had harbored about her. She was not just a perpetrator. She was the embodiment of the ideology. The two women, now captured, presented a stark contrast in the utilitarian interrogation rooms of the temporary military police outpost. The contrast between them was profound, illustrating the varied forms of evil they had faced. Elsa Keller, despite her wild struggle at the farm, now sat in her chair with a rigid, almost terrifying calm. Her eyes, however, still burned with an unholy fire, a cold, unwavering zealotry. Miller sat opposite her, trying to maintain his composure against the sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from her. Her presence was like a physical weight, crushing the air in the small room. "You believe in nothing but lies," Elsa stated, her voice surprisingly steady, almost academic, a chilling lecture. "You believe in weakness, in pity for subhumans. I performed my duty. I followed orders to purify the Reich. The prisoners deserved their fate. They were vermin, an infection on the body of Europe. I was a surgeon, removing the cancer." She spoke with the chilling self-righteousness of a true ideologue, utterly devoid of empathy. Miller leaned forward, his voice low, controlled, fighting to keep the tremor of rage out of his tone. "You ordered women whipped to death, Keller. You set your dog on starving men. You sent children to the gas chambers. You tell me that was your duty? That was purification?" He slapped a thick file of documented atrocities on the table, the sound echoing sharply. Elsa sneered, a flicker of contempt in her eyes. "Weakness, sentimentality. The weak must be culled for the strong to survive. It is the natural order, the law of nature. You simply lack the will to understand true strength. You cling to your bourgeois morality while the world burns and reforms." There was no remorse, no flicker of doubt, only a chilling, absolute conviction in her depravity. She was utterly unrepentant. In the next room, Hayes interrogated Greta Hoffman. She was a different kind of monster, a study in carefully constructed self-deception. She wept, her shoulders shaking, her words choked with self-pity and feigned fragility. "I was just a simple clerk," she sniffled, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. "I only typed the names. I had a family to protect. They would have killed me if I didn't comply. I was a victim too, caught in a terrible system." She played the part of the frail, helpless woman, an act that was almost convincing to the uninitiated. Hayes, though younger than Miller, had learned quickly to see through such theatricality. He produced detailed reports, signed by her, authorizing the transfer of thousands. "Frau Hoffman, witnesses saw you at the selections, personally supervising. They saw you calmly instructing guards to take infants from their mothers, without a word, without a change of expression. They saw you counting the dead, dispassionately, as if they were inventory. You didn't just type names. You were part of the machine that sorted human beings for extermination. You were the grease in the gears of death." Greta's tears intensified, but her arguments grew weaker, her denials less convincing. She kept trying to minimize, to deflect, to present herself as a passive bystander, a pawn. But the weight of the evidence, the cold, hard facts, was crushing her carefully constructed illusion. The two MPs conferred briefly outside the rooms, the air between them heavy with the twin burdens of hatred and calculated indifference. "She's a true believer," Miller said of Keller, shaking his head, rubbing a hand across his weary face. And Hoffman, she's the one who makes you question humanity itself, the one who just goes along and lets it all happen, the one who proves that evil doesn't need a uniform or a snarl, it just needs a pen and an empty heart. Captain Vance, observing their exhaustion, reminded them, her voice firm but not unkind, "Our job isn't to understand their psychology, gentlemen, not yet. Our job is to gather facts, document every crime, build an airtight case. Evidence, not emotion, will secure their conviction. That's how we ensure this never happens again." Her words were a stark reminder of their professional duty amidst the personal horror. The setting was a makeshift courtroom, part of the extensive preliminary hearings being conducted in Nuremberg before the larger, more famous trials. It was a somber, formal affair, though held in a building that still bore the scars of war, a constant reminder of the context. Elsa Keller and Greta Hoffman sat at separate tables, guarded by grim-faced MPs. Elsa remained defiant, her posture rigid, her face set in a contemptuous sneer, her eyes burning with an unholy light. Greta looked paler, smaller, her eyes darting nervously, avoiding the gazes of the prosecutors and the handful of observers. Their rudimentary German defense counsels looked weary, their arguments based on technicalities and claims of duress. The prosecution called its next witness. Anna Novak, a woman in her 60s, frail but with a fierce, unwavering light in her eyes, shuffled to the stand. She was a survivor of Dora Mittelbau, her body thin, her hair sparse, but her spirit indomitable. Her voice, though trembling initially, grew stronger with each word, filling the solemn courtroom with a quiet power. "I was there," Anna began, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom until it locked onto Elsa Keller, then Greta Hoffman. Her eyes, though clouded with unspeakable memories, held a clarity that pierced through their defiance. "I saw them. I witnessed everything. I survived, so I could tell." She spoke of Elsa Keller's German shepherd, Satan, unleashed on prisoners for minor infractions, tearing at their flesh, the screams echoing in the barracks. She described Elsa Keller's laughter as she watched, her enjoyment of the spectacle of suffering. She recounted seeing Elsa personally select the weakest for arbitrary executions, her face devoid of pity, a cruel smirk often playing on her lips. She had a special whistle, Anna recalled, her voice barely a whisper, for when the dog was to attack. Then she turned her gaze to Greta Hoffman, her eyes hardening. Frau Hoffman. She would oversee the transports to the special camp, where the sick and the weak were sent to die. She stood at the gates checking names off a list, her face blank. She never smiled, never frowned, just checked. I saw her hand an infant to a guard once, an infant snatched from its mother's arms without a single word, as if it were a parcel, not a human life, as if it were routine. Anna's testimony was a raw, visceral wound, reopening the deepest scars of the past. The details, specific and horrifying, brought the abstract concept of crimes against humanity into agonizingly sharp focus. Elsa glared defiantly, unyielding, almost challenging Anna to continue. But Greta, though avoiding eye contact, seemed to shrink further into her seat, a tremor running through her body, the mask of normalcy finally cracking under the weight of spoken truth. The emotional toll on the observers, including Miller and Hayes, was evident. Hayes openly wiped a tear from his eye while Miller clenched his jaw, battling his own rising tide of anger and sorrow. Miller and Hayes, observing from the back, felt the weight of Anna's words like a physical burden, a heavy mantle of responsibility. This was why they were here. This was why they had to do this. For Anna, for all the Annas, to ensure that their stories were heard, their suffering acknowledged, and that justice, however imperfect, was served. Months later, in the summer of 1946, the military court delivered its verdicts. The proceedings had been meticulous, every piece of evidence weighed, every testimony cross-examined, every legal loophole painstakingly closed. Miller and Hayes were present, sitting together, a silent vigil, their faces etched with the fatigue of the long pursuit. The judge, a stern-faced officer whose voice was heavy with the solemnity of his duty, read the sentences. Elsa Keller, for her direct participation in and enthusiastic perpetration of torture, murder, and systematic cruelty, was found guilty of multiple counts of war crimes. The sentence: life imprisonment. She received the news with a cold, almost triumphant smirk, a look that seemed to say she was a martyr for a lost cause, utterly devoid of regret. Her unrepentant evil was chilling to the very end. Greta Hoffman, for her complicity, for her chilling efficiency in facilitating the machinery of death, for her callous indifference that led to the deaths of thousands, was also found guilty. Her sentence: a lengthy prison term, 25 years. She simply stared straight ahead, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, perhaps relief that it wasn't life, perhaps just the final, crushing defeat of her self-deception, the complete shattering of her carefully constructed world of denial. She remained impassive, betraying little emotion. Miller leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly, a profound weariness settling over him. It wasn't perfect. No sentence could ever undo the suffering. No prison term could bring back the dead. But it was justice, a measure of it at least, a declaration that such deeds would not go unpunished, that the world would remember. "It's over, Dan," Miller murmured, his voice hoarse, a mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. Hayes nodded, rubbing his temples, the lines of fatigue deeply etched on his young face. "Is it, Sarge? Will it ever truly be over? This kind of evil?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, unanswerable. The war had been officially over for more than a year. The files were closing, the missions winding down. Miller and Hayes were packing their office, a temporary space that had been home for too long. Desks were being cleared, maps rolled up, the remnants of their grim work boxed away. They were preparing to return home, to a world that would struggle to comprehend what they had seen, what they had done, and the sheer depth of human depravity they had witnessed. They knew they would never truly leave Germany behind. A part of it would always remain with them, a dark, indelible stain on their souls. The room was almost empty, save for 2 dusty packing crates and the lingering smell of old paper and stale cigarette smoke. Hayes picked up a blurred photograph of the Dora Mittelbau camp, a stark black and white image of barracks and watchtowers, a symbol of humanity's darkest depths. He studied it, then looked at a small framed picture on his desk, his family smiling, unaware of the horrors he had walked through, a poignant reminder of the normalcy he longed for, yet felt forever separated from. "Did we really make a difference, Sarge?" Hayes asked again, his voice quiet, almost lost in the cavernous space, the question a persistent echo of his earlier doubt. All this, the interrogations, the chasing, the nightmares, did it matter? Will anyone remember? Miller walked to the window, gazing out at the recovering German city, already rebuilding, already forgetting, or trying to. A faint spring breeze carried the scent of new blossoms, a stark contrast to the death and decay he had known. "We tried, Dan," he said, his voice imbued with a weariness that went bone deep, a wisdom born of fire. "We made damn sure they couldn't just walk away. We made sure they were held accountable. That's a start. It's not everything, but it's a start, for the record, for the survivors, for everyone who said never again, and for those who will come after us, so they know the price of silence, the cost of indifference." He turned from the window, his gaze meeting Hayes's. "Justice isn't a neat package, Corporal. It's messy, it's incomplete, and it never truly heals the wound, but it carves out a marker, a warning, that even in the face of unspeakable evil, there are those who will pursue accountability, no matter the cost, no matter how hard they try to hide. We did our part, Dan. We made sure some truth saw the light of day." They walked out of the office, leaving the shadows behind them, but carrying the indelible weight of what they had witnessed. The sounds of a city slowly coming back to life filled the air, a testament to resilience, but also a stark reminder of the fragile line between civilization and barbarism, and the constant vigilance required to maintain it. The pursuit of justice, often slow and painful, serves not only the victims but also history itself. It ensures that the faces of those who committed atrocities, whether through active sadism or chilling indifference, are not simply erased from memory or allowed to blend back into anonymity. It is a constant, vigilance-demanding task, A stark reminder that the seeds of evil can lie dormant in the most ordinary of souls, ready to bloom into horror given the right conditions. And that, in the darkest hours, it is the duty of humanity to confront them, to speak the uncomfortable truth and to say, "You're under arrest." And in that act, to affirm that some crimes are unforgivable, and some debts, however immense, must always be paid. The legacy of their work, in the quiet, painstaking hunt for the Aufseherinnen, was a testament to the idea that even in the aftermath of unimaginable horror, humanity could strive for accountability, could seek to define right from wrong, and could, however imperfectly, ensure that the echoes of atrocity were met with the unwavering voice of justice. It was a victory not of arms, but of conscience. If you found this story compelling and believe in the importance of remembering history, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into untold historical narratives. Don't forget to give this video a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps us bring more stories like this to light.